Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Centre for this evening's program titled Universal Food Security, Platform for Peace and Prosperity. We have two distinguished speakers with us today, Professor Glenn Denning from Columbia University in New York, who will speak to us on food security based on his book on the subject. The talk will be followed by a conversation with Professor Shivsharan Someshwar, who also teaches at Columbia and at Sciences Po in Paris. We are honored to have you both with us at the VIC. What would it take to achieve a genuinely food-secure world, where every person gets to consume the right quantity and quality of food to live a healthy, active, and productive life? This is the question they will address today, to help us imagine a world without hunger and malnutrition while protecting the planet. To briefly introduce the speakers, Professor Glenn Denning is Professor of Professional Practice and Founding Director of the Master of Public Administration in Development Practice program at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He previously held senior management and research positions at the International Rice Research Institute, the World Agroforestry Center, and the Earth Institute. He has advised governments and international organizations on agriculture, food security, and sustainable development policy in more than 50 countries. Born and raised in Australia, Denning obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural science from the University of Queensland, a PhD from the University of Reading, and an MPA degree from Harvard University. Shivsharan Someshwar is a development clinician, diagnosing the development of cities and nation-states. A visiting professor at Columbia University, New York, and at Sciences Po, Paris, he was the founder, chairholder of the European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po. He helped set up the initial national and regional networks of the Global Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and has convened and chaired the Independent Task Force on Creative Climate Action. Someshwar has a PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and he was a Bell MacArthur Fellow at Harvard University. He has 2 master's degrees on housing and on environmental planning, and is also trained as a professional architect. He has previously worked at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. He publishes on sustainable development, climate change mitigation, ecosystem management, and related subjects, and edited Reliving the Memories of an Indian Forester, memoir of S. Shyam Sundar. He's also done podcasts on climate and development. Detailed biographies of the speakers can be found on the BIC's website. For those of you who are here for the first time, the BIC is a space for informed conversation, arts, and culture. You can sign up for email notifications of our programs on our website. Just a brief reminder to please make sure your mobile phones are switched off or on silent mode. And with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Glenn Denning.
Thank you, Pratiti, and thank you to the BIC for the very kind invitation to talk about this topic. For those of you who've been following BIC and participated in their events, you probably did not see many events on agriculture and food security, but the word culture is there in agriculture. And I think it's worth reminding everybody that agriculture played a very important role in creating the conditions under which people with their arts and culture could really flourish. Folks who didn't need to go out and dig the ground and plant seeds and harvest crops for the rest of us. So I'm going to be talking about agriculture and kind of more broadly about food security. So universal food security, a platform for peace and prosperity. So let me begin as an introduction to define food security. And this is really the best definition that I'm aware of, at least the formal definition. And it came out of the World Food Summit in 1996 in Rome. And it is as follows. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now, that's a mouthful. That's 34 words. But the key points are all people, all times, nutritious food as well as adequate food, and for an active and healthy life, not simply for survival. But I decided to make it a little easier for you and reduce that definition to 14 words or so. Universal food security is a world where every person enjoys a healthy diet derived from sustainable food systems. So the emphasis on every person, healthy diet, sustainable food systems. The reason for using that term universal is my understanding, and I think a widely held belief, that food is a human right. It was embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the International Covenant in 1966, as I mentioned, the World Food Conference in 1996, and of course the most recent Agenda 2030 of 2015, where the theme of sustainable development was that no one should be left behind. So the idea of universal means we're going to reach everyone with food security. India was in fact one of the first countries and remains one of the only countries to incorporate food security into the national legislation through the National Food Security Act. And so it sort of took food from being more of a welfare issue to one of being a right, that every person in the country should be entitled to food and to safe, sufficient, and healthy food. So, food security in India, the context would be that India is a nation where every person should enjoy a healthy diet from sustainable food systems. So just imagine that. Imagine every person, 1.45 billion people in this country enjoying a healthy diet. So food is critical, of course, and Josette Chiran, the former executive director of the World Food Programme, has this very nice quote, and there's nothing more basic than food. If people don't have it, one of three things happen. They revolt, they migrate, or they die. And I take this a little further. There's something else that could happen short of this, and that is that they're basically malnourished. And the idea of, or the concept of stunting, hunger, chronic hunger, leading to reduced growth and development, body, brain, greater susceptibility to disease, poorer performance in education, poor livelihood potential. So this is the global scorecard. Stunting, 150 million children under the age of 5 are stunted. So really we're talking about children whose potential can never be reached. So they're off to a terrible start. It's very difficult and very rare to be able to really reverse stunting. So 22% of the global population. The number in India is 36%. Wasting, 7%. Wasting is underweight for height, which is what we more commonly see in kind of droughts and conflict situations. It's acute malnutrition. This term hunger, we hear that a lot. So-and-so might say 700 or 800 million people are going to bed hungry. Now, when we hear that, that's actually a formal UN definition describing energy, available calories. So it says nothing about the quality of diet. It's purely about energy. But then there's micronutrient deficiency. We all depend on micronutrients like iron, like vitamin A, like zinc, and so on, for a healthy and productive life, for growth. More than 2 billion people, and some estimates put it as high as 4 to 5 billion people. More than half the world population have one or more micronutrient deficiencies, and so on. And these have basically economic, social, and environmental consequences. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. But let me just home in a little bit for a moment on India itself and this challenge of stunting. Now, India has managed to bring the stunting levels down fairly substantially over the past 20 years or so, from around 48% to about 36%. Okay, so it's heading in the right direction. But I think everybody would agree that 36% is too high. When 1/3 of the children under the age of 5 are already off to a bad start, that's not a good foundation for a healthy and prosperous society. The distribution of stunting varies greatly within India. You can look at these two maps. You can focus on this one, the most recent data. The darker colors, we're talking about 45 to 50%, so significantly above the national average, all right? A few hot spots there, well over 40 and up to 50%. But then we see diversity there because certain parts of the country, we can see the south, some up here in the northwest, are in that lower level. So, 20, 15% and so on. That doesn't mean sort of we're off the hook there. That's still 1 in 5 children not getting a sufficient diet to live a healthy and prosperous life. So this is this highlights the importance of context and the importance of diversity within a country, as of course, and across the world in coming up with solutions. I'll get to those later. There's another side of the malnutrition story, and people talk now about a term, it's called a double burden. Double burden is where nations and frankly even households can experience the double burden of undernutrition and what some people call overnutrition, the idea of consuming excess amounts for your good health and leading to overweight and obesity. At least 2.5 billion people on the planet are in that category of overweight and obese. Diet is one of the major factors that contributes to overweight and obesity. It's not the only factor, but it is a major contributing factor. And it's certainly one of the risk factors leading to non-communicable diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and cancers. So if you combine the undernutrition and the overnutrition, we're talking about a world where almost half the population, around 4 billion people at least, are experiencing some form of malnutrition. In India, overnutrition, again, it's like the stunting story. It varies from different parts of the country. This is only on the basis of state, not broken down to districts, but you can see a lot of diversity in the fact that some parts of the country are experiencing very high levels of 50% or more of overweight and obesity. So that's one side of the story. That's one side of the food security story. Remember, I said that, yes, a healthy diet, but it needed to be derived from sustainable food systems. Now, these are sort of some of the factors that are the result of human encroachment on land in order to produce food. About 38% of the world's land area, the Earth's land area, is now occupied by agriculture. The number in India seems to be about 58%, so it's even higher. 70% of the freshwater resources that are extracted go to agriculture. In India, I believe the number is about 80. 80% of the freshwater extracted goes into farming. The other 20% goes into urban consumption, domestic consumption, and industry. Somewhere between 25 and 40% of the Earth's surface is already degraded. Biodiversity losses are high. And importantly, 1/3 of all the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change come from the food system. It's not all about agriculture. Agriculture is about half of that 1/3. But land clearing, food waste, transport, energy, and so on, all related to the food system, mean that about 1/3 of it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so put all this together, and not surprisingly, right now, we're at a red alert. There's a global food crisis like no other we've had in history. And it's very much in the news. It's very much in the news. December 2022, Xi Jinping identified agriculture as a national security issue. Not a food security, it's a national security issue of extreme importance. In 2023, in response to concerns about availability of food and potential price rises, India banned the export of non-basmati rice. Now, that led to shockwaves around the world. Rice importing countries paid much higher prices, and you can see that on the way that the rice prices went up on the right-hand side there. Now, they've come down since then, but not all the way down, right? So India was influencing world prices. Philippines, Indonesia responded. Various groupings like the G20 and ASEAN responded. African countries were extremely concerned. And they continue to be concerned because almost every African country is a net importer of food. And many of them depended on wheat coming from Ukraine. And so that's been disrupted as well. So my take-home points for this part of the talk, the first part of the talk, sort of setting the scene, is that really our global food system is not delivering in terms of human well-being, in terms of health and environment. Increasingly, we're seeing stresses and shocks to our food system caused by a growing population, changing food demands, environmental degradation, climate change, and conflict. The poor and the marginalized are the most vulnerable to these price shocks, and it affects reduced income. It reduces their income, which in turn reduces their ability to purchase food. A great transformation is needed for achieving universal food security, and it clearly should be front and center, close, if not at, the top of the Indian agenda of politics and economics. So that's all about the why, right? That hopefully you're all convinced that food security is important. We need to address it. But how do we achieve universal food security? What would be required? And this was the challenge that I took on. I spent decades working on agriculture, very sharply focused on agriculture, increasing yields, increasing production, part of the Green Revolution, particularly on rice. Also worked in Africa. But particularly as I came back to Columbia, and I went to Columbia and I started teaching, I really started to search for clarity of best practice because there was a lot of confusion out there, a lot of myths, a lot of contradictions. And that search for the truth led me to the book that is out the front of this room, which I didn't ask for, but it's there. But the idea was, it was really a search for the truth. So I went to the peer-reviewed literature. I reviewed more than 600 published papers, and task force reports and the like. I went out and I sought expert opinion from so many diverse experts from different parts of the world, different disciplines and the like. And I drew, of course, on my own 40 years as a practitioner. I really went in with the idea that it is science, context, needs, and rights that should shape our policies and our practices, not ideology. But a disclaimer, at the end of the day, this is my take on what's required for food systems transformation. I concluded that basically we needed to focus on five key areas of the food system. And I'll just briefly go through these. Sustainable intensification, producing more food with a reduced environmental footprint. Market infrastructure, connecting farmers to markets. Post-harvest stewardship, ensuring that we use the food we produce. Do you realize, globally, 1/3 of the food that is produced is never consumed? So that means all of the energy, all of the water, all of the nutrients any land clearing, greenhouse gas emissions, all of that, 1/3 of that is really wasted. Healthy diets, I spoke about already, trying to fill the nutrient gaps for those who are suffering undernutrition and reducing excess intake of those who are consuming too much. And social protection, the idea here that there are many in society who are really not in a position to fulfill their own food security with their own means. So society has to step in. Governments, international organizations, and the like need to step in, and communities step in to support others in times of need. And a number of cross-cutting issues that are not really directly part of the food system: education, health, women's empowerment, good governance, all of these factors, elimination of conflict, they're all important. But within the food system, I focus on these big five, but the big five must be in context. Okay, so it's not a blueprint per se. It's a framework that can be applied in context in different situations, because there are different pathways for achieving universal food security. So, sustainable intensification. I'll just go in a little bit more detail on sustainable intensification. Many people think of that as an oxymoron. Like, if it's intensification, how could it possibly be sustainable? But the fundamental argument here is that we really have a limited amount of land on the planet. I already said we're using most of the arable land that exists, with a few exceptions, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America. But in Asia, have a look at this map look at the map of India. That's cropland, basically. It's the crops are occupying. You're not going to be able to expand the land frontier in India. In fact, globally, cropland per hectare was around 0.445. So about half a hectare per person on the planet. Now it's down to about 0.22 or so, roughly by half the amount of cropland per person. Now, what's got to happen? Especially with many people on the planet are not basically getting the food they need anyway. It's a challenge. One has to produce more on existing land. And the argument in my book that I came to the conclusion was that we have no choice but to increase productivity. Now, that doesn't mean we go to every farm on the planet and try to increase production. Absolutely not. I think of it much more as a sort of a process in aggregate. Overall, we need to produce more food. Now, all estimates, they range from we need to double production overall globally. I've heard 75%, I've heard 25%, but I've never seen any credible modeling or estimation that suggests we can simply carry on with the same level of food availability we currently have. Okay? For a number of reasons. One is the population is still growing. So last year we passed 8 billion. We're headed towards 10 billion. We'll probably be 9.7 billion by 2050. And it's estimated that we will kind of level off globally at about 11 billion by 2100. Okay, so population will continue to grow, more mouths to feed. People's diets are changing as incomes rise. People consume more. There's more livestock consumption. A lot of these livestock actually need cropland. Okay, poultry, pork, and these, and to some extent beef, they require more grain to be produced to feed them. So all of these factors. Now, another factor that's very important and often overlooked is that many of the places where we currently practice agriculture, it's completely unsustainable. We actually need to go out of business there. We've either degraded the land to a point where we're getting minimal amount of production, or we're extracting way too much. We may be extracting water at a pace that, and there are parts of India that fit that description, at a pace that really cannot continue for another 5, 10 or more years. So we really, as I said, for sustainable intensification, think of it as a process in aggregate. In some areas, we're going to have to double production. In other areas, we can probably keep it at about the same, but we've got to be much more efficient, much more precise in terms of water use, in terms of nutrients, energy use, and the like. Some areas we simply have to abandon, and we have to plant them with trees and horticulture and other enterprises. But at the same time, we also need to protect our natural ecosystems, because as demand for food increases, it's very tempting. It's very tempting to expand our land frontier, to go out and cut down trees and plant more crops. So the net result of all this is more food, less environmental impact. The second, as I mentioned earlier, market infrastructure. Basically, this is about moving food that is sustainably produced to places where it is sustainably consumed. You know, the fact is, urbanization is increasing. Okay, we're way over 50% now of population living in urban areas globally. It's likely to be close to 70% by 2050. So all of us living the urban life need to depend on farmers to produce the food so that we can continue our livelihoods. So transport infrastructure is important. Energy, electrification, as we say, is important. Information communication technologies, connecting people with information is critical as well. So investing in market infrastructure is very important. Post-harvest stewardship, I mentioned this, you know, the tragedy of 1/3. It varies from commodity to commodity, from country to country, from urban to rural, but nevertheless, efforts are being made and more needs to be done in terms of introducing technologies that will enable us to reduce our losses, infrastructure like electrification and better transport systems to enable us to get perishable goods to markets. More often than not, the perishable goods are also the most nutritious goods. And human behavior. We need to work on human behavior as well, because the idea that particularly food waste, a lot of food waste is really generated by behaviors that are not necessarily taking into account the real cost of food and the cost to the environment. I mentioned healthy diets already, how important healthy diets are, and especially here in India, where I said we've got 36% of children stunted and off to a bad start in life. There are a few implications I just listed here that would be, I think, of interest. Improving the value of rice and wheat. You know, the poorest people get most of their nutrients from rice and wheat. All right? They depend on that because it's cheap. It's the cheapest food. They don't get it from necessarily vegetables and fruits and meat products and milk and all of these things. So one possibility is biofortification. Okay, so improving availability of nutrients within crops like rice and wheat. Increased research and development on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. What that means is focusing more and putting more money into improving the yields of crops that are more nutrient-dense, and even animal products that obviously bring greater nutritional value to the table. Programs like the support prices could, for example, although officially these crops are on the books, actually allocating money to increase procurement of pulses, of fruits, of vegetable, of livestock, fishery products, and making them available at subsidized prices to low-income consumers is really, putting that 2013 Act into practice, if we can do that effectively. Public-private partnerships, developing healthy, nutritious processed foods. Now, processed foods get a very bad rap, and rightly so. Ultra-processed foods are terrible for your health, right? They tend to be high in carbohydrates, sugars, high in salt, high in fats, and so on. They're tasty, they're cheap, right? And that's why people consume them. And why can't we work with the private sector to produce more nutritious foods that, process? One of the other things about process is it's convenient. You can store it easier. So healthier processed foods would be important. And curriculum development around healthy diets and cooking. I honestly don't know to what extent this exists in India. I've been pushing hard on this in Australia, where I'm from, and in the United States and elsewhere, to build it into the curriculum of schools so young people from the beginning understand where food is coming from, the importance of nutrition, how to cook food, and rather than simply going out and buying cheap but ultimately unhealthy alternatives. Social protection, as I mentioned, this is for people who effectively are outside the market system. I think the midday meal program is an excellent example of social protection. School meal programs worldwide play a very important role, although it is a misconception that school meal programs will bring down the rate of stunting because the horse is bolted by then. So over the age of 5 or 6, a lot of the damage of stunting has taken place already. But nevertheless, it's very important for a number of other reasons, for growth and development, for educational attainment and the like. And the targeted public distribution system, again, if it could be more focused on nutritional quality, I think that would be a great advance. So again, no formula here as such. It's just critically important to put a portfolio of investments together in context, urban, rural, this state, this district, that district, but coherently at the national level. So we've talked about the why, we've talked about the what about the how? All right, so how do we actually do this? The knowledge is there, but how does that knowledge get translated into action on the ground? Now, you can sit back and you can wait for a miracle to occur. You can come up with all the great ideas. You can read my book. You can do a PhD in food security or agriculture. But what happens? How do we translate that? How do we bring that? What is the pathway to universal food security? So not depending on a miracle, but actually being proactive in designing programs. So what's it going to take? This really was the most difficult part of my book, was like, it's the so what? Like, what does it mean? How do we do it? And I really came down to this idea of agents of transformation. At the end of the day, it's all about people. People acting on their own, in groups, and in institutions. So having the knowledge, as Professor M.S. Swaminathan, my mentor for many years, used to say, you need the know-how and the do-how. We need to couple the know-how with the do-how to deliver results. So the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, meaning the NGO and community-based organizations, the higher education sector has a very important role to play in injecting these ideas of working across sectors. This problem of stunting, this problem of food security is really complicated. There's no silver bullets. There's no simple answer. There's no simple answer. It's, you'll hear, oh, well, we have all the food we need. We just need to redistribute it somehow. Or if we just cut out food waste, if we could only cut out food waste. So put all these together. If we could stop eating meat, that's another one, especially in the United States. We get that a lot. We stop eating meat and then everything will be fine. We all become vegetarians and vegans and our problems would be over. But it's way more complicated than that. Not least, I think it's 1 billion people on the planet actually depend on livestock for their livelihoods and nutrition. At the end of the day, even then I wanted to go one further step, and that is to argue that it's really about leadership, because individuals take action at all levels. And here I mean leadership at all levels. Leadership that will promote effective governance, will introduce and support policies, innovations, effective communications, negotiations, building capacity, and mobilizing the finance to create the change that we're looking for. I think there are some really big challenges ahead, and also opportunities. These are really my global list, but I think you can probably check off most of them in the case of India. We need to reduce stunting to near zero. We'll probably never get to zero, but we need to do that. Many countries have moved it down very quickly. Brazil has almost not eliminated it, but it's really come down a lot. So look to the experience of Brazil. Many other countries, even in the region, Nepal, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, they've all brought stunting down by almost half. Reversing overweight and obesity, I don't have any success stories. There's not a single country on the planet that's been able to bring it down at this point. Hopefully they will in the future. Genetic engineering, very controversial, but I strongly believe, and I argue it, a whole chapter on this in the book, that we really need to capture and utilize the benefits of the genetic diversity that we have on the planet. And it seems almost morally wrong that the beneficiaries of the most advanced approaches to genetic engineering are all in the global north. It's farmers in Iowa and Australia and Brazil and Argentina. It's not really the global north, but they're following the same kinds of practices, large-scale farms. Why can't that be more democratized and focused on the needs of small-scale farmers? Finance and insurance for smallholders. Many of these are great ideas, but people are going to say, well, I don't have the money. I don't have the finance to be able to do this. And banks and insurance companies run away from this because it's so messy to deal with large numbers of small-scale farmers. But you're going to have to do it because, like, look at India. I don't know the exact number, but 100 million plus smallholder farmers, people with about a hectare, sometimes even less than a hectare of land. How do you reach those people with finance? How do you do that effectively? Farmer-producer organizations is one model that is showing promise. We talked about agriculture as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. Can it be part of the solution? Again, we have this challenge of how do you make this happen with small-scale farmers at scale? Artificial intelligence, digital technologies. Again, this is normal practice in Western agriculture. Tractors that go through a field and adjust their seeding and fertilizer rates based on sensors. Very precise application, precision agriculture it's called. How do we downsize that such that it can be used, adapted? And I think it's entirely possible. I mean, we went from computers only being available to huge companies or big government agencies, right? To having each of us having a computer in our pocket, more powerful than any of those original computers. So we can do the same. We need to be able to do the same to improve the food system, to transform the food system. And finally, smallholder, we need to support smallholders to achieve quality and scale for greater competitiveness, because I think more and more we're moving out of a stage where we're thinking of agriculture for survival, agriculture for subsistence. Agriculture has to be a business. And that's the only way we're ever going to attract a new generation of farmers back to the farm, is if agriculture can be modernized, can be supported by artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and can be really focusing on market opportunities. Now, quick history lesson. In 1967, so more than 50 years ago, this book came out, William and Paul Paddock. I doubt if it's in your library here, but it was called Famine 1975, America's Decision, Who Will Survive? An absolute classic. It was a bestseller in the United States, right? And it was at that time of famine, of extreme concerns, political, social, economic concerns related to food insecurity in the world. The argument was America, which was at that point pretty much the only country that was generating large surpluses of food, wouldn't be able to save the whole world. They'd have to have a triage system. And so they had come up with these three categories. Can't be saved, the walking wounded, and should receive food. Fascinating. And look where India was. Can't be saved. It was in the can't be saved category. It didn't describe, the rationale for that kind of got a little bit, blurred with the Cold War rhetorics and so on. But nevertheless, the point is, India was written off in 1967, at least not necessarily by everyone in the West, but certainly by some of these critics at the time. Well, it turned out all wrong. Malthus was wrong. And the Paddock brothers were wrong too. And India was able to turn it around to the point where today it is, by some margin, the largest exporter of rice in the world, and has been for many years. Took over from Thailand several years ago. So that transformation is something that gives me a lot of hope. It gives me a lot of hope. When people say, can you give us any success stories anywhere? It always seems bad, always negative. But this is a great example, notwithstanding all of the valid criticisms that some of you are probably already thinking about. But the idea that a country went from being written off to being actually a critical player in global food security, to the point where when the government decided to cut those non-basmati exports, it had ripple effects around the world. So I think this sets the stage for a second green revolution. I'm going to still have to come up with a better name than this, but I think the idea is that 50 years on, basically, we need to transform our food systems. Today I'm focusing more on India. I think there's no doubt smallholder farmers are here to stay. They still basically occupy, I think it's 87, 88% of the agricultural land, and produce most of the food in the country and for export. It needs to be, this second green revolution, more focused on income generation and market-oriented value chains. Needs to be more diversified beyond rice and wheat. We need to spend more time focusing on improving product quality. We need to increase value addition, because that will create not only higher incomes for the farmers, but also employment opportunities, both in urban and rural areas. I mentioned before nutrition-sensitive agriculture that would improve the availability of more nutritious food by bringing down the price and making it more accessible to to consumers. Sustainable intensification, for rice and wheat, but also for these other commodities I've been talking about, building resilience to increase climate variability and change, and reducing agriculture's environmental footprint. Nutrition-sensitive social protection systems, but emphasizing local procurement, procuring from, which Brazil and a number of other countries are doing successfully, purchasing from local farmers to feed into the social protection system. And I think ultimately a big difference between the second green revolution and the first green revolution would be a greater role of business, of the private sector. The first green revolution was very focused on governments. This would not be. So this is it. This is sort of a bit of an overview of sort of where I've come to. And I would quote not a great philosopher, but a famous baseball player, American baseball player, Yogi Berra, who said, "The future ain't what it used to be." This applies very well in this situation. The future of agriculture and food security ain't what it used to be. This is not 1967. It's a very different world. The challenges, we're not facing famines, correct? We've succeeded in that respect. India's not going out asking, depending on the generosity of others. But the challenges actually are still great. Chronic malnutrition, growing population, vulnerability to climate change and climate variability, all these factors are there. So my sense is the future is what we choose to create. And this evening I've tried to give you some ideas on how we might bring about that great transformation in context, with equity, and with less of an environmental footprint. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Glenn and I have been colleagues for many, many years. And before we get into the business of agriculture, I thought it would be important to ask him a couple of things. One is India and Australia are tied at 1-1 in the test series with India and Australia. So if you had to predict, knowing that you're in India, what would be your prediction?
It's difficult to predict the future, and in some situations it's also dangerous to do that. But I hope at the end of the series we'll look back on it and say cricket is the winner here.
Oh, no, that's a wimpy.
Is that too corny?
That's totally wimpy answer. He didn't give the answer.
That was an icebreaker.
All right.
Yeah.
So Glenn, thank you for an extremely lucid and comprehensive book on a topic that actually demands that, but especially most academics shy away from, because it's, as you saw, it's not just about agriculture production. It goes into issues of access to food, goes into issues of how to actually have a functioning market that then is also regulated well. So, for example, you need a balance of governance. You need the state, which is a regulatory function, but if it becomes too much regulatory, it scares off investments. At the same time, this is not kind of a Milton Friedman type, let the market, let the food arena be entirely market driven. And it's too bad. And it's too bad that small farmers are not able to compete. That means, like a Darwinian, then they need to go out of business. In most parts of the global south, including India, that would simply be politically unpalatable and in fact would lead to a lot of chaos. There are other ways of aggregating the produce of small farmers, such as FPOs, food producers, organizations, companies, cooperatives, and so on. But in his book, Glenn kind of actually walks through all these kind of tough challenges without kind of shying away. Whereas if you are kind of a modeler, if you're an economist modeling food security, it's actually much easier, because in your model you can actually wish away many of the tough challenges, which is why economists always they pick and choose what they want to kind of model. So what I would like to kind of begin is, you mentioned the question of leadership, the importance of leadership. Can you, in your own words, kind of describe, I know that Professor Swaminathan you worked with him, under him at IRRI in Los Baños in the Philippines for many, many years. Where he was what's it called? He was the DG, the Director General of the International Rice Research Institute. How would you describe his leadership? What were his kind of qualities of leadership of Professor Swaminathan?
Okay. Yeah, well, he was a very special kind of leader. I think we always, a sort of a standard a term we associate with leaders is having vision. He certainly had vision. He was the first Director General of our institute that really, I think, recognized the role of women in agriculture, in rice production, and in food systems. So he championed that. So I think that having that visionary approach, at a very early stage, he put me in charge of a program that would work on diversification of, to look at all the products that come out of the rice field, not just the rice, the straw, the bran, and so on, that, byproduct utilization, recognizing, I mean, rice farmers generally, small-scale rice farmers, never reach prosperity. They, at best, they may generate surpluses that may enable their children to go to school and perhaps to move to another profession. And there's good evidence that that was one of the impacts of the Green Revolution, that people invested in the next generation in education. So, I mean, thinking that those sorts of things and the importance of genetics, he was in fact the first Director General who actually saw the potential for genetic engineering, but he wanted that to be pro-poor, pro-women, pro-environment. He would emphasize that all the time. So I think that's part of it. I think it's being compassionate, having vision, being compassionate, being very open to partnership. I think that's a characteristic of a great leader. Being able to create sometimes unlikely allies in seeking to solve a problem. He reached out to, all governments, including those that were not viewed very positively at the time. He reached out to NGOs that were often hostile to us at IRRI, because they had theories about connections to the United States, to private sector, big business, and so on. So I think there's a number of traits there that he demonstrated that I think we can certainly learn from. I mention him, frankly, all through the book. I spent 6 years with him from 1982 to 1988. He was the Director General. I was a very junior person. I used to travel with him to countries, and the doors that would open because of his just his knowledge, his grace, his humanity. That was really something I sort of carried with me all my life. He would always focus on the small farmer, the poor farmer, the women. Even within our institute, he would go out and talk to the laborers, talk to the people who are cleaning, serving the food, cleaning the hallways and the labs and so on. That sort of compassion and humanity is something that we learn from,
No, thank you. Many of you, of course, may not know that Glenn is no stranger to South Asia and Southeast Asia. He's been coming here since what, the early 80s?
Early 80s.
Can you just do you have any fond memories or nightmares of your time broadly in South Asia? I know that you have been going to India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and so on, especially focused on rice, focused on how to enhance rice productivity, rice production. So it is not just as tourism. It's not that you come and can do safari. So he's been at the forefront of engaging with the national agricultural scientific systems. So could you just talk about the national agriculture systems in some of these countries, and which countries have done exceptionally well, in your opinion?
Well, I think one thing that struck me a lot about Asia, even from the first day I arrived at IRRI in the Philippines, that was July the 7th, 1980. Is the centrality of food. The idea that you greet somebody in local language, in many languages, the greeting is, "Have you eaten rice?" I'm not sure if it's true in some of your languages here, but certainly it is in the Philippines and Cambodia and a few places. So the idea that it's central to your life, it's part of your livelihood, it's part of the economy, it's part of your culture, it's often tied very much into your religion. This struck me in ways that, frankly, I never thought of growing up in Australia. Food was just there, right? Mm-hmm. You enjoyed it, so I think that's one, and that sort of translated into government commitments. I came I wasn't there in the sort of heyday, I'm not that old, of the Green Revolution, like in the 60s and all, like when everybody was running, scrambling to get these varieties out into the field and get production up and get food distributed as quickly as possible to avoid actual famines. But still, the level of kind of high-level focus on food security, and actually a term called food self-sufficiency. The idea was that it's too dangerous to not be self-sufficient. You know, we've got to be self-sufficient. And the Philippines, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, all of those countries were striving for self-sufficiency, producing enough, particularly of the main commodity, particularly in Asia, it's basically rice. When I went to Africa, it was much more diverse. It was maize and cassava and other kinds of crops. But here it was really about rice and to a lesser extent wheat. So I think, I just sort of felt that I'd really hit on the right profession. I mean, agriculture, and particularly agriculture in that part of the world that was so central to life, to your own well-being, your own productivity, and ultimately, your ability to live a healthy and productive life.
I'd like to open up the floor for questions. And before I do that, one last question for Professor Denning is, how did you end up focusing on agriculture? Did you grow up in a farm, or what's the story?
I grew up in an urban setting, a suburban setting, so no farm background at all, myself. My father was a farmer before we came along, before he settled down, got married, and had us. He was a farmer, so we would get stories of farming, but his frustration at no longer being a farmer, he became an orchid grower. So he used to grow lots of orchids. So I had to be, I was in charge of making sure they didn't die when they went away for a few days. I had to water them and look after them, keep the bugs off them, and so on. And I guess, growing vegetables in the backyard and doing things like that, I just sort of like to see plants grow. It just gave me a good feeling. And I think I got to about 17 or 16 or 17, and I thought, well, how could I actually put this into practice and earn a living out of it, right? So I actually went from that direction, really from a very urban background, but with a strong interest in plants, and decided to take agriculture at university, agricultural science, in my undergraduate degree. But even then, I certainly had no sort of vision of saving the world or any of this sort of thing, or even leaving Australia, to be honest. It was pure serendipity that I ended up in my 4th year of undergrad. A university, one of the professors had a program in Indonesia, and another student was already scheduled to be going off there to spend a year there. And I just happened to overhear a conversation when a group of us were milling around having a coffee or a tea or whatever it was back then, that he wasn't going. And, if I'd been standing a few more feet away, I wouldn't have heard that. But when I heard it, I went to him and said, well, is that true? Yeah, I don't want to do it. So I went down to see the professor, Ross Humphreys. And I said, oh, Professor Humphreys, I might be interested in that. I still don't know why I said that. I don't know. I mean, it's not, I've always been wanting to do that. But I went down. He said, well, come back next week, because I wasn't in the specific area that this research was on. So I came back next week, and he said, you're in. You're going. Off I went to Indonesia, to the island of Bali, 1975. Spent a year there.
I think when he says Indonesia, it really overheard Bali.
No,
yes, count me in.
And it was, it was a tremendous learning experience. It was a life-changing experience, and I won't bore you with it, but if there'll be a book in the I'm going to donate a book, put it in the library if you want to read about it sometime. I sort of went from one experience like this to another. So to any of the younger folks in the audience, don't plan out your life too much at this point. Allow, put yourself in a position where serendipity happens, that you're in a position to take advantage of some of these fortuitous meetings and occasions that you sort of chance upon. And here I am with this wonderful friend and colleague of mine, Shiv Sameshwar, sitting with you tonight. That's another example of that. Here I am. And so I'm really super grateful for that. As I said, it wasn't something that I'd planned at all, but for anybody interested in this area of agriculture, but more broadly in food security and food systems, I cannot imagine a more fulfilling life. Now, some of you in the more artistic realms might disagree with that, but it's complex. You're connecting with human beings. There's never simple answers, but you're constantly moving around, interacting with humanity, people struggling, people succeeding, and you kind of carry on. And I really don't have any regrets at all.
Thank you. Who'd like to have the floor? It could be an observation. It could be a specific question. You could ask any.
Hello, sir. Hello, professor. So you were talking about the India's second green revolution, right? What do you think about millets being part of that? Do you think they'll become big? Do you think they'll become a major part of that revolution?
That sounds like a politically loaded question, that one. We've just come from the year of the millet, right?
It's a bit, this just is the year of the millet, declared globally. Also in India, there is a huge push for millet. So I think that's why it's a background.
Look, millets are a crop that grow well under certain conditions, right? They've evolved usually under tougher, climatically stressed conditions than your mainstream cereal crops of rice and wheat. There's been a great expansion of irrigation in India over the last few decades, and that has been responsible for this. It's certainly contributed to this rapid increase in rice and wheat production in the country, to the point of self-sufficiency plus, right? And in many cases, it actually replaced millets. Now you can say, right, if you compare a bowl of millet with a bowl of rice, millet is more nutritious, right? There's no question about that. It has better nutritional value. But if you compare necessarily a hectare of rice with a hectare of millet, at this time I'd probably go with the hectare of rice, sell some of it, and buy pulses, lentils, milk, vegetables, rather than saying, let's put it all over to millet because millet is more nutritious. Now, having said that, right, that's the first thing to say is we should not take our eyes off the ball when it comes to rice and wheat. But that said, a lot more work could be done on more nutritious crops, and a lot more investment could be done to improve their productivity, which in turn would make them more accessible to low-income consumers. So I think millets are still going to grow in the dry, marginal, remote areas, although they may also struggle there too with climate change. It's very complicated. There may be more floods, there may be higher temperatures and so on, which will complicate matters. But I think I would like to go forward. My point about millet is we should think about millets as part of the food system. We should make sure that where we can, they can contribute to improved nutrition. But let's do it on the basis of science and needs of people to consume a healthy and balanced diet at an affordable price. Okay, so I'm all for millets, but it should not, we shouldn't be overwhelmed by any kind of more of an ideologically driven push towards lesser used crops. And millets aren't the only example. There are many other crops out there, many other lesser known and lesser used crops, which over time have been replaced by some of these more productive ones.
Are you also then referring to the returns to the farmer in terms of incentive prices?
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, there's no question that the improvement in rice and wheat productivity and overall production over a long period of time has been greatly supported by government policies, including procurement and pricing policies, not just for the actual product, but also for the inputs that go into it, water and energy that go into these crops. So there's no question that that's the case. But let me sort of take you back to the thinking behind that. The idea that if we do not meet the basic staple needs of a population, it can lead to essentially catastrophe, social disruption, extreme poverty, hunger, all of those things, if we don't really keep focused on making sure that basic cereal crops, basic staples are available to consumers at a reasonable price. That is why, as I said, all of these leaders around the region, from Southeast Asia to China to India, across South Asia, they're very much concerned about availability of food. And look what happened during COVID. Look what happened when there have been disruptions in global supply chains. And that's caused many governments to even double down on some of these things. And, as much as they were starting to think, well, we can always import rice when we need it, and we can get wheat when we need it, and so on. I think a lot of the challenges associated with COVID and other disruptions that we've had in the past remind people to keep focused on food security. But government has levers to work with, and I think I do believe that more attention should be given to not just price support, but research and development, more investment in R&D on some of these more nutritious foods.
Yeah, the lady in the back.
I have another question.
Okay.
You
can ask Professor Shiv if...
Yeah, I mean, it's
well.
a question to both of you,
Okay.
because you've been in the field and you've seen India, India's agricultural scene. So I'm also a researcher at a think tank, and we currently work on a project advising the government of Odisha about making their agricultural scene sustainable. So in my research, I found out that a lot of things in the agricultural scene is influenced by the caste system. So for example, farmers, rice farmers, paddy farmers, for example, if they belong to the upper caste, they control the access the access to irrigation. So they may not let certain communities access irrigation as much as they can. Or if you look at other aspects, like for example, growing millets. Millets are seen as like a poor man's food, so people are incentivized to grow those. So do you think that, I mean, though this is like a research from my side, this is how I see it, but from your experiences over the years, do you also agree that this is a part of, it is a major influence in agriculture? And what are the ways around it? What do you think are the ways around it?
Thanks for you. The caste.
we should have offline conversation because there are many issues here, because it's also issue of power and powerlessness, and how do you kind of access resources given localized and in a stratified society. How do you kind of actually, without resorting to complete revolt and revolution, what are the ways? So we can actually kind of discuss that. That's a great question.
We talk about it in our class, the class that we teach together at Columbia. This is 1 week of intense discussion on this very issue. Yeah.
So I have two questions. One is the Green Revolution. Has it really worked for us? Because it introduced a dual cropping system in Punjab. And that has now come with so many other issues, stubble burning. It's causing so many issues which we cannot resolve. So that's one question. The second is like, say, a crop like sugarcane, which is a water-intensive crop. It's a water-greedy crop. Also, sugarcane can only be harvested now because there's so much of sugarcane, only when they get cropping instructions, only then can they harvest that, in which case the sucrose level goes down. And there are so many other things linked to that. So it is contextual, but the science is not working for us. And our farmers are struggling. At the same time, so much of water is diverted to the sugarcane in Karnataka. That's the other issue. The third issue is with agriculture. India is the largest exploiter of groundwater. Traditionally, it has been. Okay, groundwater levels have depleted to an alarming degree. In Bangalore, urban and rural, it is 100%, more than 100%. And yet, water is a right to life. It is guaranteed, it is meant, we cannot survive without water as much as we cannot survive without food. And how much of our water should be directed towards agriculture when we don't even have water to drink? So, three things, not a little complex, but yes.
Right. Well, I'll certainly have a shot at the first one. I think the problem with the Green Revolution, in examining the Green Revolution and putting it into context, it's difficult to imagine what the counter narrative would have been. What had there not been a Green Revolution, what would we have had? I mean, your points are, absolutely, fine. That there have been many negative consequences, along with many positive consequences of the Green Revolution. It's probably true of many things in life that it's never all good. I always remind myself that agriculture is fundamentally a non-sustainable activity for 8 billion people, or for 1.45 billion people on this little plot of land we call India. To continue to sustain that population, we make major changes to the environment. So in addressing that, I would like to, and I think there have been a lot of improvements over the years. There's a lot less pesticide being used on rice. There's a lot more consciousness about, if only for cost reasons, about applications of fertilizers and the like. I always say, in a difficult situation like that, we start with what is here now. Today is the starting point. What would we do to make agriculture more sustainable? And that was that sort of list of things that I was talking about, including, like if we're extracting water faster than, at a rate where, it should be reasonably easy to measure at what point there just won't be any water, we need to stop it. I mean, it has to stop, right? And so who does that? The individual farmer, somebody who's impoverished, their food and their income depends on this. They're not going to do it. They're going to act in their own interest, right? You would do the same, I would do the same, until the water's gone. I mean, that's just the way it works, and we hope for a better life somewhere else, maybe. That's where I think enlightened leadership from governments and civil society working in public interest should advocate for being able to support people to change those practices, to provide incentives for them to stop over-consuming, whether it's water or nutrients or energy or whatever. So I think we just have to go, and I think the sugarcane story is the same. Now, we need to examine the sugar industry. So why would we promote, you know, honestly, a relatively low-value crop in sugar when we have such a precious and limited resource as water in this country, particularly in the drier states? Why would you put that water on sugarcane? For heaven's sake, put it on something that adds more value. Put it on fruits and vegetables and, you know, horticulture, other, you know, not even rice. Like where water's in very short supply, rice would be the last thing I'd be growing. Grow it in those places where there's lots of water and there's not much else that can grow. But don't, you know, it doesn't make any sense. So I think, you know, all of this is in context. All of this, you know, we have to remember in the 1960s and even the 70s, there was really a panic about, like, you know, large numbers of people may die if we don't increase availability of food, right? Fortunately, the Green Revolution had a formula. It was new varieties, fertilizer, irrigation, double production, more food. Price of food went down. So what's often forgotten is the major beneficiaries of the Green Revolution were low-income consumers. Low-income consumers. Not necessarily the farmers. The farmers got, you know, there was a certain amount of sharing, but look, there's the first Green Revolution variety out of Erie was called IR8. IR8. It took off like crazy from 1967, 68. There are people now called IR8. Children were named after the rice variety. Such was the level of enthusiasm and, you know, joy as a result of being able to rapidly increase their food production and achieve food security. So we can't dismiss the Green Revolution. I think it, in many ways, what it has done is provide us the way I look at it is provided us a platform from which, you know, we've made some improvements, but there's still so much more to go. It has not addressed chronic malnutrition. It hasn't addressed stunting. It's, you know, maybe brought it down a bit, but so much more could be done. So don't necessarily blame the Green Revolution for that. Say, well, what should we be doing to make sure that children aren't stunted? It's not only about nutrition, but it's certainly part of it. It's about water and sanitation. It's about intra-household equity as well. Many factors involved. Behavioral issues, you know, exclusive breastfeeding. There's a number of factors that all come in to, that's why it's so complicated. It's one of these thorny issues that it doesn't just require, you can't just produce your way out of it. You need a whole of government approach, you know, and you know, across different contexts. So I probably haven't answered your question very well, but, you know, I think my main point is, like, let's start from where we are now and see how we can make progress. And that was really the notion of that second Green Revolution and what we should focus on.
Yeah, please, in the back.
Hi, Glenn. Hi, Shiv. I don't know if you remember me. Devina, class of 2020.
Yes.
Thanks for GFS. I've missed it. Thank you for being here. I have a question. Given that women represent or contribute to about 43% of the agricultural labor force across the world and are disproportionately impacted by climate change-related crises, I'm curious to know, and it's been 4 years, so very fair question. If there's anything, if there are innovative approaches that you've seen come through when it comes to especially looking at equitable access to resources within women-led agricultural households, and also when it comes to decision-making power, etc. Thank you.
FPOs, cooperatives, you should.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the, you could probably answer that better than I could. I mean, India actually has some of the best examples of active women-led groups seeking to correct biases and disadvantage of women. And, you know, I think it's not universally successful or scalable. You know, I think, again, we keep coming back, that's the word we probably use in our sustainable development course more than any other, it's context. We keep saying it's all about context. But I think, you know, there are numerous cases in India and in other parts of the world where, and I have more sort of personal experience recently in Africa, where women's groups have totally led the way in terms of demonstrating how, if they are given resources, financial resources, to diversify their income, to improve, you know, productivity, often with livestock enterprises rather than cropping enterprises. So, you know, this idea that typically women are generally more focused on livestock than crops. So promoting that in context, I think, is important. I think ultimately, and I'll think we can maybe take a little bit of a pat on the back for it, but the kind of program that, you know, we've been running at Columbia for the last 15 years now, which you're a part of, this year is 90% women. 90%, right? So we've seen, when I went through agriculture, telling about, I went to that agriculture program at the University of Queensland. There were 44 of us, 2 women. And I suspect that's probably historically what it was like in India too for a long time. But I'm hearing now that that's also shifting in India, right? Especially if we think beyond agriculture as just farming. We think about agriculture, we think about it as a business, we think about the use of technology and innovation and these things, and enterprise. I think women can play a really great role. So I think really investing in education programs to empower women, encourage them and ensure that they move through the system and provide that kind of leadership that I spoke about in my talk. I think that, and I mean essentially going right to the top, right? The more women we have in those kinds of positions, the more likely they're going to be advocating for women around the table, right? We're lucky at SEPA. We have a dean, Karen Yahi-Milo. She is promoting a very strong women's initiative for SEPA itself. We have, I won't mention names, but we have a number of very prominent women now entering the ranks of our faculty and senior leadership, not only at SEPA, but across Columbia. So I think, that's, the more we can do that here and, everywhere, the more chance of success we have in moving away from the biases and the disadvantages that were promulgated in the past. There's one over here.
Yeah, sure. And then
up the back.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes.
5 minutes,
so
okay.
we need to be,
So brief answers.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for the excellent talk and great panel discussion. I have no experience or expertise in agriculture at all, but my question is, what can we do? Do you have a view on what is ethical consumption or what we should aspire to? For example, there's a lot of talk on, eating locally sourced. And I was also once admonished for including too much quinoa in my diet, which I was told is so special to certain tribes, and not to overconsume that. It may hurt the. I have no idea. It just seems so complex what you read and often so conflicting. So, is there anything we should just be aware of for those of us fortunate enough to exercise a choice in that?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, like, not just for food, but for anything you consume, is to try to understand where it comes from. That would be the first thing. So where does your food come from? Who produces it? Under what conditions is it produced? So it to be an ethical consumer means to consume in ways that do not have at least social or environmental negatives beyond what might be considered reasonable. How do you do that?
How would you know that? Unlike many other things, like say clothes, we know where they're produced. If it comes from a sweatshop, it's really hard to know that about produce that you just pick up somewhere else, isn't it?
I think you could ask.
No, but now in fact, there is a higher level of traceability now with many of the products. Yeah, you can actually be curious and kind of go beyond the obvious question they will give you. But I think, as Glenn was saying, I think it's really important for us to first understand where is the food coming from, and then who is producing it under what conditions. Because then, if it kind of seems immoral to you, then to kind of then show your preference for some other food, because that's a very good market signal. Talk to your friends and your circles to say, look, I thought this was locally grown, ethical by, I don't know, maybe women farmers, but then you find that it's actually a corporate chain that may be using women farmers, but then actually is extracting most of the profits. So one thing is advocacy, and advocacy through as a consumer. And second is advocacy through actually kind of writing about it. Now, in this day and age of communication. And I think you expressed a very nice sentiment about how do you kind of be true to yourself and have, in a very ethical manner, lead your life. And in this case, food. One thing, for example, would be to avoid water that comes in plastic bottles. Because then, who knows where they are kind of extracted. And for example, a lot of people are proud about drinking water called Fiji. Actually, it comes from the island of Fiji. Can you imagine the carbon footprint of that water? So first is to say, no, look, you know what? We're not going to kind of have that. I see in many high-end restaurants, they say, oh, would you like to have water from Fiji? No, you should actually call up the manager and say, look, this is not ethical, this is not correct. So, but that's a really good sentiment that I wish more people kind of had. So the last question.
Look, just quickly, I think trying to understand food. The fact you started off by saying, I don't know much about this stuff. Like, and Davina, you would say that, like, in our food class, most of the class that comes into my class to begin with, a lot of them are urban folks, and they don't know much about it either. But I think that's step number one. Really try to learn more about food, what it is, where it comes from, where it's grown, what are the issues around that. So read and discuss, and it's it's a real joy to be able to do that. Then, as Shiv said, if you see some opportunities, get involved in terms of advocacy and support for organizations that are working for more sustainable and equitable food systems. And to me, the ultimate is go out and have a profession in that area, actually work in that area, be part of the change, whether it's in government, the private sector, the UN, start your own social enterprise, any of these possibilities. I think there's lots of things you can do, but it all starts with just sort of understanding the food system, better than you do now.
Hi, I'd like to know how can we balance the need for sustainable agricultural practices with the growing demand for food, especially in an increasingly urbanized world?
That's the great question in life, isn't it? I mean, so that's the great question to I like to say, to understand the food system and to understand food security, real food security, is to understand how the world works. It's as fundamental as that. So, you know, balancing is exactly, I think that's the right term to use, because, you know, us humans are we're basically an invasive species, okay? We invaded Earth, and like we've grown. We were 10 billion people. No, sorry, we were 10 million people 10,000 years ago at the dawn of agriculture, the Holocene period, where domestication took place and we started to produce food. We're now 8 billion heading to 10 billion, right? So we are invading the planet. So there will inevitably be environmental impact. But I hope that I've, you know, explained today that there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of opportunities actually to work with what we have now. We can't go back 10,000 years. We are where we are. And we are in India, and we've got all of these problems that you've kind of raised here. What do we do to start improving sustainability and at the same time having a more equitable food system? Because we're a very long way from universal food security in the world and a very long way from that in India. But that's a noble and ethically important target, that we reach every person, that every person should have a healthy diet, and that we would be doing everything possible to transform our system to be more sustainable, meaning future generations will be able to have that same healthy diet.
I'd like to close off with one last observation, would be to be wary of simple answers, because the issues are complicated. To be wary of simple answers such as go organic, no genetically modified organism, locally produce your food. These are seemingly simple, and also they seem ethically kind of the right kind of answers, but it all depends on the context. And by context, we not only mean the ecological, the environmental context, but also the economic context of who is asking, who is deciding. For someone who can afford it, of course, maybe going the organic way is the right thing from a health perspective. But to wish that for society, then you open up Pandora's box of extreme challenges. The same thing for GM. I think it is morally wrong for European NGOs to say no to GMOs in Africa, because you can actually enhance double production under the right conditions in Africa, but they are actually imputing their kind of values on a society. So that again, no GMOs may work at a personal level, or maybe within a family or within a community, it may work perfectly fine. And in fact, it may be the right ethical stance to take, but then one needs to be extremely careful of saying that should be the public policy without first examining all of these other challenges then will emerge. How do you feed 1.4 billion people if you go organic? There are many, many instances where communities have failed, societies have failed, the most recent one being Sri Lanka. So my sense would be, when people come up with simple answers, this is what you need to do, this is what we say in class, it always should be followed up by a lot of questions. You always need to be curious. Doesn't mean that you need to be cynical, but you need to be curious to examine, okay, what's the information, what's the data, what is the bias, who's going to be impacted? So with that, I'd really like to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Glenn Denning, who's come all the way from New York for us.
Thank you, Professor Glenn Denning and Professor Shivsharan Someshwar, for an honest look at the many challenges faced in agriculture and presenting hope in your pursuit of solutions, despite all of the many challenges that our planet faces. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thank you.